Podcast shining a light on the science lurking behind the news.
We know lots of scientists and we're not afraid to call them up.
Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Poriadok, organizované všetko dobre.
She said it was all good, there was a lot of order, organization, and that she was happy with how it was. In the organization where she worked, they would get spa or holidays or retreats. They had the camps for kids, and they also always got their flats, especially for young families, flats in the town.
It's not unusual for people in Central and Eastern Europe to be nostalgic for the communist days, particularly people of a certain age. Those who avoided trouble were provided for throughout, from cradle to grave. Then the old order came crashing down. In its place, free markets, globalization, and chaos. Or so the story goes. Over the past decade, across Europe and beyond, voters have flocked to politicians who promise to clean up the mess. Slovakia is a prime example. This is Robert Fico. He's already been Prime Minister twice, and according to opinion polls, his party is set to return to power in a few weeks' time. I'm John Kampfner, and I've been travelling around Slovakia ahead of elections at the end of this month that could have a seismic effect, not just on this small nation, but also for the rest of Europe and the wider West, starting with Russia and Ukraine.
When it comes to political support, the governments we had in the past 3 years have really very openly shown support for Ukraine, have openly labeled Russia as an aggressor.
Dominika Hajdu is head of the Centre for Democracy and Resilience at Globsec, a think tank based in the capital Bratislava that monitors the former communist states. What's remarkable about Slovakia is that per capita it's been one of Ukraine's staunchest backers. That, she says, looks set to change.
Currently, there are parties which very openly express their reluctance to support Ukraine, especially when it comes to armed supplies and military support. And if these parties win or form the coalition government, there is really a chance that the EU unity or the NATO unity in terms of the support for Ukraine could crumble further.
Since Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Slovakia has gone all in, even providing MiG-29 jets to Ukraine. All the while, opinion polls have pointed in the opposite direction. Dominika Hajdu gives me the rundown.
When it comes to the war itself, the majority of the population says that it's either the West or Ukrainians themselves who are primarily responsible for the war. Only 40% of Slovaks actually believe that it's Russia who is primarily responsible for the war, which is the lowest percentage in the entire Central and Eastern European region.
Globsec's latest annual survey makes for salutary reading, with Slovakia often out of step with its neighbours. Now 50% of Slovaks believe the United States to be a security risk, a figure sharply up on just a few years ago. If the elections follow predictions, and there's still a lot to play for, this country could be about to do a 180-degree turn and go full pelt for Putin.
My name is Luboš Blaha. I'm the member of parliament and the vice chair of Slovak Social Democratic Party, Smer Social Democracy.
Smer is comfortably ahead of all the other parties in the polls, and Luboš Blaha, an unabashed scourge of the liberal West, could become a prominent member of the government.
We need to stop sending the weapons and the military equipment to Ukraine, and we need to stop this war, whatever price. I can understand that Ukrainians wouldn't be happy that they will lose, for example, Donbass or Crimea. But still, I think now in this situation, we need to be realistic, we need to be in the table, and we need to speak Russians, Americans, Ukrainians, everybody who is involved in this war, And we see that this war is not only the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We see it as a proxy war of the United States against Russia in Ukrainian land. And this is something very different.
I spend an hour with Luboš Blaha sitting on a terrace outside Slovakia's parliament. He's a consummate polemicist, as many populists are. But the longer he talks, the more extreme his language becomes. He frames Russia's conflict with the West less in military terms, more as a culture war.
People in Slovakia are very mistrusted to the Western individualistic culture, especially in these cultural issues like these LGBT, like these family issues. And when we see that there are politicians who are more maybe conservative or who are maybe more traditional, there is a little sympathy for them. And it's not because they are making the war. It is not because they are making some undemocratic measures, but because they are protecting their national culture, national identity against this liberal mania in the West.
What is the liberal mania?
In cultural issues, it's this progressivism. It's progressivism that you can have so much success or genders as you can, and this is something which is not very popular in Slovakia. We have just families with mothers, fathers and children. We don't need to have families with fathers and so on.
What I find so extraordinary is here we are, we're sitting in the parliamentary cafe right next to Parliament, over the Danube. As we're looking straight ahead, beyond the forests is Austria. I was in this spot in the 80s when this was the Iron Curtain. It was impossible for you, your family, or anybody you know to cross that highly fortified border. And now you're talking about liberal American fantasies and liberal fascism. What on earth happened to any idea of liberal democracy?
Well, first of all, people found what is capitalism like. This is the first question. The imagination was before the revolution, or how to say it, Velvet Revolution, was that everything will be good, that the wages will be good, that living standards will be like in Sweden or like in Austria. But then the reality came, and people are poor. People in Slovakia are still poor. So they are asking, okay, now I am free to be a capitalist, but I have no money, so it's not something option for me. I have a freedom to go to Madagascar or to go to Argentina, but still I don't have money. I don't have the freedom to go to the shop and buy something, bread or milk for normal prices. And this is something which is very important for their lives.
Once a Marxist and pro-gay rights, Luboš Blaha has, like other alt-right populists, been on some journey. Smer, his party, still has Social Democrat in its title, but in its politics it couldn't be further away. And yet, on cost of living issues, its pitch has wider resonance. Marta, the 78-year-old we heard at the start of the programme, is voting for Smer, hoping that it will magic things more towards the way they were.
There weren't such differences between people, the poor weren't as poor and the rich weren't as rich, so there weren't such great class differences. And nowadays some people are very rich and maybe they don't even deserve to be rich. And she says with privatization it invited all of this corruption and stealing from the state, etc. So they made their wealth from that.
Corruption doesn't belong to the outgoing government. It's been endemic for years. Yet recent times have been particularly fraught. Successive coalitions have come and gone, struggling to cope with the pandemic, inflation, the energy crisis, and the war. The last administration collapsed in December, dogged by infighting, and Slovakia has been treading water ever since.
If I have to be honest, to this town I don't enjoy coming back that much. It's only out of necessity that I come here or because of my family.
This is Lucia. She's Marta's granddaughter and has been assiduously translating for us. She shows us around Topolchani, the town where she was brought up and where most of her family still live. It also happens to be the place where Robert Fico, the likely next Prime Minister, was born.
The town itself, there is not much to do here. Many people, especially my peers, like people who I went to school with, they left for bigger cities like Bratislava, or they went to the Czech Republic, for example.
I don't wish to sound rude, but she's right. There's not a lot here. Topvar, the local brewery, got taken over and closed down. There's a church, a few restaurants, and a communist-era town hall where we're standing. Like her classmates, Lucia legged it as soon as she could. She's now a lecturer in sports PR at a college in Wembley, in the west of London. Like other Slovaks living abroad, she's determined to vote and is opting for a more pro-Western progressive party. Their worldviews may be poles apart, yet she and her granny share similar thoughts about the failure of globalization and the loss of social solidarity. She also points to another reason for the malaise.
We have never really had many interactions with people from foreign countries because we were pretty much closed under communism, and then even if the borders opened, nobody is running into Slovakia to explore it, you know, like, for example, it's not a tourist destination. So people are not used to meeting foreigners, and what they see on the media is usually, you know, immigrants on the boats or all of these negative aspects of immigrants, and especially, you know, with this alternative media, what they are creating the narratives about how much criminality they are causing or raping women.
The past preys on the present, and so here's a quick reprise of the history. This part of Europe belonged to the huge Habsburg Empire. The Czechs to the north and west were more oriented towards Austria, while the smaller Slovak lands to the south and east were assimilated by Hungary. Dominika Hajdu of the think tank Globsec harks back to Slovak nationalism of 2 centuries ago.
In 19th century, the key group of nationalists that were evoking Slovak national identity were led by Ludovic Stur. And besides other ideas that they were pursuing, one of them was of Russia being this big Slavic brother that will save us from the oppression by Hungarians under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And since then, this idea of Russia as a big brother of this pan-Slavic unity has been persisting.
Czechs and Slovaks came together as Czechoslovakia after World War I, but its independence lasted a mere 20 years. On liberation from the Nazis, Czechoslovakia came under Soviet rule until the Velvet Revolution of 1989 and the supposed victory of Western liberal democracy. A few years later came the Velvet Divorce. Slovakia, a country of only 5 million, started out on its own without knowing what would happen next.
My name is Grigory Mesezhnikov. I am political scientist and political analyst. I'm the head of the Institute for Public Affairs, which is an independent think tank located here in Bratislava, Slovakia.
Unsure of whom to turn to, a natural instinct was to look to the past, to look east.
Slovak leaders somehow connected this destiny rather with Russia. It was based on these ideas of Slavic brotherhood, Slavic solidarity. Today it's playing the toxic role because it works, this concept, the idea of preference of ethnic elements, not universal values. So substantial part of Slovakia's population is still influenced by this.
In the mid-1990s, while other post-communist states were embracing Western values, the Americans put out a warning about Slovakia. Madeleine Albright, the then Secretary of State, called it the black hole of the region. Membership of NATO was delayed. Eventually it did join in 2004, the same year it also became part of the European Union. The assumption then was that Slovakia finally had a settled identity and a settled set of alliances.
There are some illusions, so-called geopolitical illusions, concerning the place which Slovakia locates in this part of Europe. Majority of Slovaks are convinced that Slovakia is not part of the West or the East, it's something in between, while we know that Slovakia is the whole organization of society is the Western. We have Western political system, we are part of 2 Western integration blocks.
Now, in spite of everything, the door has been opened for the remarkable return of Robert Fico. In his previous 2 spells as leader, he would fulminate against the West from time to time for his domestic audience, but he was careful not to go against big international decisions. Then he was suddenly forced out of power. Grigory Mesheshnikov takes me to the spot in the center of Bratislava which marks the darkest moment in the short history of this independent nation.
It's a memorial site of two persons who were murdered by the forces of clientelism and criminal activities in 2018.
So we're in National Uprising Square in the heart of Bratislava, and to my right is the impressive statue to the partisans who stood up to the Nazis in 1944. Just 20 or 30 meters away is something more esoteric. A giant set of two leaves, two broken brown and silver leaves, with the inscription of two names, Jan Kuciak and Martina Kushnirova, who were both born in 1990 and both died in 2018. A journalist and his fiancée, gunned down by contract killers.
When this murder happened in February 2018, thousands and thousands of people came to the street, including this square in Bratislava, for protest rallies and demands of removal of the government.
I've come to the village of Gregorovce. It's about 40 minutes or so outside the city of Košice, that's Slovakia's second city. And I've come to see Zlatica Kushnirova, who is the mother of the murdered Martina Kushnirova. It's a bizarrely idyllic spot to have a really difficult conversation about why they were murdered and what the consequences of that murder are for Slovakia both then and now.
2-3 týždne po vražde. No, na mňa boli útoky hneď zo začiatku. Mne chodili aj listy.
The first hostile letter came just 2 or 3 weeks after they were murdered. I received hate speech on social media. I have 2 plastic bags of letters that were written by haters, people attacking me. It was probably because I attended the protests and was kind of a rebel. They didn't like it. They said I should be grieving and praying quietly at home, not on stage in public. They thought that was unacceptable for the mother of a murdered child. It was physical letters. Sometimes they just typed the name of our village, Gregorovce, and the post office knew they were for me.
With Fico's government suggesting that the murders were part of a Western conspiracy, even some of those closest to Zlatica started to spout the propaganda.
For example, my husband's cousin. I've known her for years. Right after the murder, she came and asked me how I was doing. But soon after, she began saying Jan was a secret agent, that he'd been paid by the USA and he'd received a huge amount of money, and that America killed him.
That's hardly how the UN, EU, and pretty much every international institution saw it. Kuciak had been looking into corruption, involving, amongst others, the Slovak government, EU subsidies, and the Italian mafia. Fico and his entire cabinet eventually quit, but the criminal cases against the hitmen and those who commissioned them have been tortuously complicated. Only a few people have been convicted, and the more Slovakia descended into legal cul-de-sacs and doublespeak, the more Zlatica fought.
Yes, I would prefer to go back in time to before 2018, when I was a nobody, before I became a public figure fighting for justice. I would love to have my quiet life back, of course, with Martina and Jan and their children, if they could have their own family. I just need my health and strength. I'm not afraid of anyone.
In the 5 years since losing power, Robert Fico has become ever more strident. The invasion of Ukraine has emboldened him further. Smer and even more radical groupings further to the right have gone on the attack. Their main weapon, online. Their platform of choice, Facebook.
So we're just a few hundred meters away from the historic old centre, the really most beautiful, evocative part of Bratislava. And this is the street where the Russian embassy, the centre for Russian disinformation in Slovakia, is located. And Dominika and I have come here because I wanted her to show me the exact place where the heartthrob of Russian disinformation comes from inside this building.
They're pumping this kind of stuff almost every day, yes. So basically the narratives that are trying to undermine the West, especially the US. We can see that a lot of websites or social media pages in Slovakia just verbatim copy the narratives or the statements that are being spread by the Kremlin.
It goes literally into the heart of the Russian embassy. This video went viral when it was released a year and a half ago.
We're seeing a military attaché talking to a person somewhere by the forest, and he's giving him 500 euros for his efforts, but also another 500 euros for his friends to cooperate.
The diplomat was thrown out. The journalist from a website called Hlavné Správy, Main News, one of many that reproduced the Kremlin line on tap, was given a suspended sentence. According to Dominika Hajdu, more than 1,800 Facebook pages share pro-Russian and anti-Western propaganda. The EU and other institutions are trying to counter the disinformation with activities of their own, but they seem to be outsmarted and outnumbered. Some Slovak citizens groups are also trying their best to stem the tide. This is Maciej Charchik. He's 20, a student, and has set up a training course, Krupica, to help young people understand how propaganda works and how to disentangle news from fake news.
I myself had a very personal experience with disinformation, actually. One of our close friends, it was right after the murder of the journalist Jan Kuciak. And he started convincing us that it's somehow manipulated from the United States, that the CIA is behind it, etc., etc.
What, the CIA killed him?
Yeah, that the CIA killed him, yeah. Then he recommended to me to start reading what I today know are disinformation media. But for a couple of weeks, I was actually following the news on these media because I myself was confused. But then it really stopped making sense. So ever since then, I have felt this urge to help others not to fall into this downward spiral.
As with other countries, politics and the concept of truth seems to be split between two groups. The mainly older left-behinds in small towns and rural areas who seem set to opt for Fico and the far right, and the predominantly young urbanites fighting a rearguard action against them, such as this student in Maciej's class.
My name is Zsovka, and I'm from eastern Slovakia. So I come from Prešov, which is about 6 hours away. I have a lot of experience with people that believe disinformation mainly because there's a bit less education there. It's also, the wage gap is like 3 times as small as here in Bratislava. So it's like a completely different universe.
Did you go to school in Prešov?
Yes, I went to school both in Prešov and here.
Right, and so your old friends from school in Prešov, what sort of things do they say?
Well, I think I encountered most of the hoaxes about COVID. They didn't want to get vaccinated. And I feel like in that region, they don't trust these authorities because of how they're treated, because they're poorer. They automatically reject every authority that was in the medical field because they immediately thought that they come from like a pharmaceutical company that just tries to make money off of the poor people. And that's why they don't want to support these institutions like Pfizer, biotech, or whatever other institutions invented vaccines.
But if you're therefore having parallel conversations with your old school friends, it makes it hard to stay friends, doesn't it?
It does. It does get a little personal sometimes, and that's why I'm trying to moderate how much I argument with them.
The schism is deep, but the election on September the 30th remains tough to call. More than a dozen parties are vying for seats in Parliament. With a 5% threshold, several of them won't get in. Their votes lost. Convoluted coalition negotiations will then follow. What is beyond doubt, however, is that Robert Fico will be a major player, and the politics he espouses is back in fashion. As Dominika Hajdu points out, Fico is taking his model from Hungary, where Viktor Orban, on his return to power after a spell in opposition, clamped down on the independence of the media and judiciary. He's not looked back since.
It's a very scary thought, especially as it would follow this pattern of Viktor Orban, who has become sort of more extreme in terms of pursuing more authoritarian policies after he came back to power. And Fico has basically adopted most of the rhetoric that Orban is using. In worst case scenario, it would definitely contribute to a harsh democratic decline in Slovakia. But I'm still an optimist, so I'm hoping for the better.
In her quiet village of Gregorevce, hundreds of kilometers away to the east, Zlatica Kuzhnirova is not so sanguine. She fears those who take on the state may suffer the same fate as her daughter and her fiancé did. Then and since, Zlatica has seen firsthand the dangers of unaccountable power. She makes this dark prediction.
Sytuacja podobna jak w Rusku. Nikt by nic nie mohol.
We could become like Russia. Only what the government wants will be allowed. Any opposition will be prosecuted, like what's happened to Alexei Navalny. They're just going to arrest people and send them to prison. For nothing, just for spreading the truth. If they're not killed, they'll be jailed.
Keď nezabijú, jak našich nezavraždia.
I suspect such a prospect is still some way off. Slovakia is, after all, still in NATO and still in the EU, firmly tied to the West economically, if not always emotionally. The deep pessimism of Zlatica and of many others is, however, an indication of how messy the politics have become and how much faith in liberal democracy has been eroded here in the heart of Europe.
Unexpected Elements is the podcast that sifts through the week's news to unearth surprising nuggets of science.
I really wanted to look at an animal that, as far as we could tell at least, doesn't seem to age.
Okay, you have my attention, tell me more.
And uncover the unexpected connections between them.
I think now's a good time to talk about worms.
Really? Worms?
Absolutely.
Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service.
Amazing stuff.
Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.